Je vais commencer par remercier également les organisatrices pour ce beau colloque qui est à la fois très stimulant et puis très convivial, comme on a pu le voir hier soir. Donc je vous remercie encore. Nous avons organisé à Paris 3 cette semaine un colloque pendant 2 jours sur ces thématiques de libre-échange. Je sais que c'est beaucoup de travail et beaucoup de stress pour les organisateurs. Okay, so I'm going to talk about stakeholder consultation and impact assessments from a slightly different perspectives, different angle from those that you've heard so far. So full disclosure, I am not a legal scholar. I am more of a political scientist, so my method is slightly different from that you heard until now. And the second difference in my perspective is that it'll be also more of a comparative perspective. My specialty is U.S. trade policy, so it's a late conversion to EU trade policy. So I've learned a lot over the past day and over the past year, trying to compare the two systems. And then finally, maybe the third, slight difference comes from the fact that I look at this from an action research perspective, and I'll say a few words in a minute on this issue. Okay, so let me. All right. Okay, so. What we have noticed over the past few years is a growing need to assess trade policies in the United States and in the European Union. So in the United States, we have you have heard that there's been a bit of an incident in international politics, the election of Donald Trump, that has completely transformed U.S. trade policy and its objectives. Here I've just put down there's 4 objectives stated by the trade policy agenda, and you see that the first 2 priorities really shift the paradigm of trade liberalization that had dominated U.S. trade policy since the early 1990s. So defending national sovereignty over trade and strictly enforcing U.S. trade laws. Now the third and fourth priorities are more conventional, but what I wanted to emphasize especially the first 2 priorities. And to take a look at the promise to reassess U.S. trade policy by the Trump administration. And here you have the quote, "Plainly, the time has come for a major review of how we approach trade agreements." Okay, and so that has been one signal that the U.S. wants to assess its trade policies. In the EU, you're now familiar with some of the things that we've discussed. This renewed emphasis on the need to assess trade policies, a number of decision and documents that were released by the EU Commission, Sustainability Impact Assessment, a handbook in 2006, even though impact assessment started earlier in 1999. In 2006, they started to clarify what they expected from these impact assessments, and a new edition in 2016 in the context of the democratic issues that we raised. Okay, so a greater need for consultation, to which I will come back in a minute. The better regulation agenda also emphasizes the need to provide, gear towards evidence-based trade policies, and the Trade for All strategy is also goes along those lines. Meanwhile, there has been an increasing attention to stakeholder consultation in the EU. Okay, here a quote from their SIA handbook. "Consultations are key to ensuring the transparency, quality, credibility, and legitimacy of SIAs by providing a dynamic and robust framework for interaction and dialogue with all relevant stakeholders." Now we'll come back to the question of what constitutes relevant stakeholders, but you see here that is clearly a consultation is clearly a part of this renewed emphasis on assessments. In the U.S., surprisingly enough, first step, Obama also had the ambition of designing a more robust public conversation, and that was one of his promises. And we could, spend a few minutes to discuss whether he accomplished these objectives. I'm a bit skeptical. We could come back to this during the discussion. What I think is more surprising is that even the Trump administration has undertaken, this form of consultation, and NAFTA. The public comments on NAFTA negotiation or renegotiation actually ended yesterday. Okay, so you could submit your own perspective on NAFTA renegotiation objectives. So this shows even under Trump administration that obviously is not famous for transparency and inclusion, that there is still a concern for assessing and resorting to stakeholder consultation when it comes to trade policy. Okay, so that's the background. So the research questions that I want to try to ask, as part of this research paper is, how much scope do impact assessments give to stakeholder consultation, and how to design better practices. Two more things. Well, about the I talked earlier about action research and the fact that this is actually a work in progress as part of an impact assessment conducted for DG Trade as part of with a consulting group. Basically, I've been part of last year we did an impact assessment on EU, New Zealand, and Australia. And this year we just got good news that we will be conducting the impact on EU Mercosur. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is that I will be working with two colleagues to conduct the stakeholder consultation. So for me, that's why I talked about action research, because obviously I wanted to know, well, what's being done, what are the issues at stake, and how can we try to improve the process. And to do so, I need to look at what's been done in the EU, but I'd like also, since I'm more familiar with the US, I'd like to take a look at what the US actually does, okay? All right. So brief literature review. I don't know if that's, it seems to be an exercise that's less common in international law than in political literature. But basically what's been published in, there are two sets of literature that you can look at to deal with this issue. Is first, civil society organization, mobilization, and or participation in on the one hand, U.S. trade policy making, and on the other hand, EU trade policy making. So in the U.S., the literature focuses mainly, I would say, on mobilization and how unions and environmentalists, but also consumer advocates have tried to mobilize against these free trade agreements. That's something I focused on very closely as part of my doctoral research a few years ago. But it's I guess there is less emphasis on institutional processes through which, these groups, civil society organizations, can engage and can try to influence the policy process. So it's either a political science or a social movement approach focusing on contestation and mobilization, or it's more of a legal analysis of outcomes, okay, and a look at labor provisions and their evolution of environmental standards, but not really on the institutional processes, how to, include these groups in trade policy making. On the EU side, and one thing about the US, the framework is that it usually focuses on two things: labor and environmental issues, and you see the reflection in the structure of FTAs in the U.S. On the EU side, I think the approach is a bit broader when it comes to analysis of stakeholder consultation. You have I would say, a broader approach to civil society that is not confined to labor and environmental organizations, and that is more concerned about procedural issues and institutional processes in general. Okay, so three problems with these two sets of literature, with this first set of literature on civil society consultation is that usually it provides little comparative analysis. So you have specialists of EU trade policy or specialists of US, but there's little cross-fertilization, with the exception of a few colleagues at Ghent University. Secondly, there's very little focus on trade impact assessments, and here the literature is very limited, except for a colleague that really tried to, well, two colleagues that were in Paris this week that tried to deconstruct what impact assessments are and talked about fictional expectations. And we can come back to this. And then third, the gap between theory and practice. I feel like there is a need also for greater, for more policy briefs, for a link between, academia and the policy and policymakers. Okay, so that's also why the purpose behind this. This is also part of a broader project that will try to release a policy brief on civil society consultation with colleagues from Ghent. Okay, within a year. Okay. How did I do that? Okay. All right. So the research design. So what are impact assessments? So on the EU side, you have actually 4 types of impact assessments. So which one should we focus on? Why are they different? So you have impact assessment, the first ex-ante impact assessment that takes place before negotiations start. Okay, so you see here on your left, at the top left corner, okay, the preparation phase. Then you have SIA, so Sustainability Impact Assessments, that take place during the negotiations, okay, that are conducted by DG Trade. Then you have a third, and they are, I would say, the most comprehensive type of impact. And then third, you have, once the text is finalized, the negotiating texts are finalized, you have an economic assessment of the negotiated outcome. So these are very quick, very trade-specific, and they're designed basically to assess whether the negotiations have reached the objectives of the Commission. Okay, and then fourth, you have the ex post evaluation. So these usually takes place a few years after the negotiations have been completed, okay, as a sort of an ex post assessment. In the United States, the process is not as systematic. It's a bit more fragmented. You have Trade Advisory Committee reports that are the most comprehensive, and that, let me anticipate, basically, trade advisory committees in the United States are a 3-tier structure. You have at the bottom 26 sectoral committees, okay, that include stakeholders. So all these committees are composed of different stakeholders. So you see, and they will produce reports. So you see from the beginning a different approach to stakeholder and to the production of these impact assessments. The second tier is you have 6 public policy committees, 2 of which are entirely composed of civil society organizations. So labor advisory committees on your left, and TPAC is Trade and Environment Political Advisory Committees. So these focus on environmental issues. They're composed of NGOs, mostly, some academics, some businesses as well. But they provide a much more, a different approach from sectoral committees that are entirely composed of companies. And then you have ACTPIN at the top, which is basically the chairing committee of this pyramid, and in which you have only 2 or 3 members coming from nonprofit organizations. Okay, let me try to go back to this.
Could you try to conclude, please?
Okay. All right. So I'll go quickly. I will skip. So basically what I choose is I focus mostly on trade advisory reports. I've tried to analyze I won't say anything about PTAC, could come back to this later. So basically I compare EU versus US impact studies based on, the agency, the scope, is that trade specific, economic, social, environmental, the phase, when does this take place, and the extent of stakeholder consultation. And then I focus on SIAs for the EU side and Trade Advisory Committee reports because that's where the stakeholder consultation is the most comprehensive. Okay, and here are the questions that I ask: who participates? And I think that's something that will be the main question that I will be focusing as part of this, impact assessment with DG Trade, is really trying to, well, what is the logic of the selection of stakeholders? Okay, how do they participate? Okay, and what influence on SIAs, and to what extent can we provide or make their input more relevant, okay? And so, to me, the question of who participate is something that needs to be, that deserves more attention than what it is given at the moment. What is civil society? If you look at EU definition, in certain documents, civil society includes businesses, in others it doesn't, okay? What is the approach used to select participants and stakeholders? They talk about a balance, representation, relevant stakeholders, but it's very ill-defined. So that's what I will try to do as part of this impact assessment, design a more robust framework. So far, the approach is usually actor-based and sector-based. I think there is also a need for a territorial approach. What are the criteria used to vet participants? Is that expertise? Is that capacity or resources? Is that the representativeness, okay? Or is that local knowledge, okay? All right, so I'll skip this, basically the research design and the period I will cover, the list, and then the preliminary findings. So again, this is a work in progress. I'll just skip to the, since we're running out of time, I'll just skip to some of the conclusions or hypotheses that I want to try to develop. First, there are similarities in stakeholder selection. Both are actor-based and sector-based, but it seems to me, again, that there is a need for greater territorial representation. Second, the EU's ad hoc approach to IAs, so impact assessment, provides more flexibility but less consistency. And we talked about this yesterday, okay, from one FTA to another. Consultation and issues can be very different, so I think that's a good thing, more flexibility, but on the other hand, less consistency than trade advisory committees in the United States, where you have stakeholders that remain in these committees for a number of years throughout different negotiations, and so that can have, I think, that can bring more consistency to the process and also more experience. Third, expertise, capacity, and representation prime over local knowledge. So, who participates to stakeholder consultation as part of these impact assessment? Usually NGOs or businesses with expertise, with capacity, resources, and the ability to go to Brussels. Representation to some extent, but local knowledge, I think, is missing, and I think I want to try to explore that what you might call an interscale or disconnect, so a disconnect between different scales of analysis. Okay, two more points, and then I'll finish. Okay. Fourth, there are limits of these deliberative processes, and there's, I think, a mismanagement of dissenting views. In the US, there's a problem of seclusion in some of these TAC reports. So basically, if you take all impact assessments on a certain agreement like TPP, for example, all this dissenting views will be secluded in the labor and in the environmental reports, okay, and the others will be broadly positive about TPP. So it's a form of seclusion that I think doesn't reflect all the contention behind these FTAs. In the EU, I think there is a form of repression of dissenting views to the extent that if you read impact assessments, they're very positive, and it's, everything is rosy, it's going to be great. Having conducted one last year, I could note that you really had, whenever you had critical things to say, DG Trade would come back and say, okay, why are you saying this? You need to back up where's your evidence? And they were, very defensive, okay, whenever you try to say critical, which I think is counterproductive because it gives this idea that everything is fine. So I think there should be a deeper reflection on the management of dissenting views that reflect, I think, the controversies surrounding these agreements. And then finally, the question of influence and accountability. This is basically the broader, the big picture question: how to connect processes with outcomes, how to make these processes more legitimate, and I think that's a common question that our panel shares, and I hope we'll be able to discuss this during the discussion. Thank you.